heard Christy make this presentation, and we take things for granted in life. And things like the Barcelona hatchery have just always been there. And we forget that it started somehow and somewhere, and the people that did that were amazing people. She's going to tell you about it tonight. So, Christy?
William Jakeway, owner and captain of that plucky little fishing tug, the Merle J, was in his mid-60s on the day that he and his crew outfished the 6 commercial fishing boats in Denver. Bill Jakeway had been a commercial fisherman his entire life. He was the 3rd generation of the family to make a living fishing out of Barcelona. And the family businesses, that was the norm in Barcelona. They went on for generations. He had joined his father, John, in the family business in 1861, or 1881, when he was 10 years old. When he first went to work for his dad, they were fishing from the Bessie Turner. It was a 2-masted, 25-foot sailboat with oars for auxiliary power. By the time Bill retired in the 1940s, the pride of the Jakeway fishing fleet was a 12-ton, 48-foot, steel-hull, diesel-powered, iconic Lake Erie fishing tug. It was owned by his son Merle, and it was named the William Jakeway. At the height of the industry, commercial fishing industry in the 20s and 30s, Great Lakes commercial fishermen in all of the 5 Great Lakes were lifting as much as 100 million pounds of fish a year. Lake Erie was always the most productive of all of the lakes. The catch from Lake Erie in those years often equaled the catch in all the other 4 lakes combined. But I want to back up a little bit from that to talk about why a 20th century historian referred to Barcelona as having declined from its glory years until it was nothing but a sleepy little fishing village. In the early decades of the 1800s, and that was the settlement, those were the years that the county was settled, businessmen, investors, and the federal government expected Barcelona to become a major center of commerce down all of the Great Lakes, and indeed it did. Barcelona owed its success as a port of entry for immigrants and as a commercial center to geography and the opening of the Erie Canal. 1825, when the Erie Canal opened, it created a noticeable increase in commercial traffic and passenger traffic on the Great Lakes, and especially Erie, Lake Erie. In those early years, I'm sorry, it's doing that. In any case, in those early years of westward expansion, as you know, the best long-distance transportation was by water for commercial as well as passengers. For the vast interior of America, as you can see, the dominant waterways that stretched from here in the east all the way into the Rocky Mountains were all part of the Mississippi River basin. For the travelers on the Great Lakes coming from the east and heading west in those years, the 9-mile overland portage from Barcelona to Lake Chautauqua at Mayville, and of course from there on down the Chattaquin, the Allegheny, eventually the Ohio, and of course the Mississippi. That portage provided the easiest access from the eastern Great Lakes to the entire interior of the country. And Barcelona was the center of it. So with the opening of the Erie Canal, the federal government took notice of all that increased traffic and designated Barcelona as an official port of entry. And the businessmen and investors had the area around Barcelona surveyed into streets, as you see, expecting it to develop into quite a big city. You will notice Portland, it was called Portland Harbor in those days. How it came to be known as Barcelona Harbor was a bit of a mystery. But as you see, Portland Harbor included a break wall that the federal government built that went 1,200 feet out into the water. There was a wharf. If you can see it closely, the wharf is called Barcelona Wharf. This harbor is created in front of what is now the Pig's Fly restaurant. Over this way would be the moose camp. So with that also came money for a lighthouse. You know it's still there today, and I hope you've been over. It's been renovated, and you can actually go up in it now. So I can't emphasize enough how much commerce and private enterprise flourished in Barcelona into the roaring 30s and into the 40s. Real estate prices down there soared. There were warehouses and blacksmith shops and stores. Then came the 1840s. The Erie Extension Canal opened, connecting the port of Erie, in Erie, Pennsylvania, with the Ohio River. And as if to prove a point about the port of Erie having a very superior natural harbor, a series of huge storms came through in the early 1840s, very much damaging the breakwater and the wharves and the warehouses. The port continued to operate, but with much damage that was never repaired. Then in 1852, the railroads came through Westfield. And of course, they diverted passenger and commerce from the lake to the land. By about 7 years later, 1859, citing the lack of a real harbor there, the federal government shut down the lighthouse. And by then, he had withdrawn all funding that they had been providing to make repairs after the storms. Think of that. That lighthouse has been out of commission since 1859. So according to that later historian, that's when Barcelona became sleepy little fishing village. But it wasn't so little, and it wasn't so sleepy. You know, I hope, that Lake Erie today and then was a fabulous fishery. It is the most shallow and therefore the warmest and most biologically productive of all the Great Lakes. You can see Lake Erie at the very end of the escarpment. So, at 10,000 square miles of surface area, Erie is the 11th largest lake in the world. It is about 250 miles long and about 10 miles or 40 miles wide at the eastern section, which of course is on the right, because that's east is on the right. It's a maximum of 57 miles wide in the western end. So the western end has an average depth of 25 to 30 feet. The The deeper water of Lake Erie is in our side, the western section. The greatest depth is 200 feet, or 210 feet, just off of Long Point in Canadian waters. The average depth of the eastern end is 80 feet. So you can imagine, back in those early years, seining along the shore would have been among the first ways that fish were caught. But Lake Erie gets really deep, really fast. And it's too deep for commercial seining to be profitable at all. And the same thing for the pound nets. There just isn't enough shallow water. Because of the depth of the lake where Barcelona fishermen operate, when my great-grandfather, Bill Jagway, went to work for his dad in 1881, Barcelona fishermen were setting and retrieving gill nets and hook lines from their sailboats. This is what the harbor looked like in about 1880, about when he started fishing with his dad. In those years, they were fishing commercially already. They were catching whitefish, blue pike, herring, yellow perch, and white bass. Sturgeon weighing up to 50 pounds, I guess, was pretty common. My grandpa Bill, when he was interviewed by the Westfield Republican, related a story, related a day that he remembered as a kid, catching a 200-pound sturgeon off Peacock Point, about half a mile out. That's a big fish. So the Bessie Turner, his dad's boat, would usually go out into the lake very early and stay within 10 miles of the shore to set nets and to collect the nets that they had set the day before. The lake there would be 80 to 100 feet deep. And there was no operational lighthouse, so they would always aim to be in before dark. My mother remembers a time when the fleet went further out than they had expected and ran into some trouble and came back in the dark. And all of the wives of the fishermen took their cars down to Barcelona on the cliff, pointed them out into the lake and left the lights on so that they could find their way back. When he was about 30 years old and married and a family man, Bill Jagway bought his own boat. It was the first of 5 that he would own. It was named the Black Boat. So we knew that's what it was. She was 28 feet long with 2 masts. She carried a jib, a mainsail, and a mizzen mast. Photos of the fishing boats with their sails up are very rare. I think I've only seen 2. And in any case, what I learned then was the mainsails were gaff rigged, for you sailors who wonder. In any case, these catches would need to be nimble in order to lay and retrieve the gill nets. So that's Bill Jagway. I think taken probably when he was around 30. John Monroe, who was a contemporary of my mom, he was a lifelong Great Lake fisherman. He described to me that fishing commercially from a sailboat as being another kind of art. And he said it took another kind of nerve to do. Any of you who know Lake Erie know that the great danger is how quickly the lake can kick up into pretty huge waves when a storm comes by. and that's because it's so shallow. Grandpa Bill told the Western Republican about a time when the lake was so rough that they had to come home with their sails down, with bare poles, he called it, driven only by the wind because the waves were too big for the oars to even work. I included this just so you get an idea. I think it's one of the best pictures we have that really give you an idea of how big or small those fishing boats were. This is the Douglas. After the turn into the new century, commercial fishermen were doing what other men were doing all over the country, and that is experimenting with gasoline engines. At first, the gas engines were used as auxiliary power in the sail lanes. They would use the engines to go out to the fishing grounds, and then they would be under sail when they were collecting their nets and laying out the new ones. Well, it didn't take them very long to figure out that the gas engines worked a lot more efficiently than doing it under sail. So a lot of the fishermen, as they did with, this is the Dandy, they simply removed the mast, mounted the engine, and put in, as you can see, they created a pilot house. You can see my great-grandfather's boat. This is you can see the Dandy, there she is in the water. His crew is bringing in the fish. And I can tell that they caught a lot more fish than they were expecting because they're also using the net crates to bring the fish in, not just the fish crates. If you'll notice the rollers on the front of the boats, the fishing boats, those are mechanized net lifters. They were a tremendous revolution of technology that changed the reach and the scope of the fishing fleet just as much as the electric or the gas engines did. So, with the power of the gas engines, they were able to go out and set more nets in deeper water. Remember, before the advent of the mechanized lifters, they had to limit their catch to whatever they could pull up from the bottom of the lake with their backs. The net lifters did the work for them. Once the sails were eliminated, the boat builders and the owners of the boats began experimenting with, at first, the closed cabins for the pilots. For a time, they left the forward deck and the stern uncovered. Then the local builders, the Lant brothers, covered the sterns. These boats were safer, and with gas engines and the steam-powered lifters, they were more powerful. They extended the reach for individual boats so much that in the fall, the Barcelona fishermen would take their tugs down to the western end of the lake, because in the spring, the lake thawed from the west. It was a much shallower lake, so they could begin fishing much earlier and selling their catch locally. This is the Merle J tied up at a dock in Huron, Ohio in the spring. Huron, Ohio is a deep port, a deep water port. You can see she has a wooden hull. She's diesel powered. and built locally by the Land brothers in Barcelona, which, yeah. These are the men who fished the lake in the 20s and 30s. We do have the name of them all their names. There's the Lant brothers, Bert and Ernie Wakely, Mr. Gutchaw, and my great-grandfather is in there as well. I think it's by the 1930s, it was common by then to enclose the bow of the boat by what is called a spray hood. With that, they created the iconic Lake Erie fishing tug, or Great Lakes fishing tug. Great Lakes is the only place in the world where this kind of fishing tug is used. By then, the 30s, the money fish were the blue pike, herring, lake trout, carp, yellow perch, whitefish, and yellow pike. Early on in the 1850s, the railroads that did some harm to Barcelona as a port by taking over the commercial traffic. The railroads were a boon to the Lake Erie fishermen because it enabled them to sell their catch to more distant, bigger markets. There were commercial commission merchants in Barcelona that handled all of the orders from the restaurants and the big hotels in New York City. That's where the Barcelona fish went. There was also at that time, because the railroads enabled them to expand their market, it also greatly increased the number of fishing tugs and the families who were engaged in fishing out of Barcelona. Haven't talked about the net. The types and technology of nets evolved over the years, and the evolution of them is so complicated, I'm not going to deal with it tonight. I'm just going to shorten it and say when Bill Jakeway started fishing in 1881, they were using gill nets. And that's the same kind of net that the commercial fishermen are still using today. Not in American waters, but in Canadian waters. You can see that the bottom is weighted, the top has floats, so that when the net is played out of the back of the fishing tug, it sinks to the bottom and stands upright like a tennis net. The flags that you see on each side, that would be a signal of which boat owned that net. We have a couple of those at the Historical Society that will be on display, by the way, at the lighthouse. So they would have been using nets that had different size meshes depending on the size, depending on what fish they wanted. You can see in this diagram that the smaller fish could swim right through. They were after the bigger fish. Again, the blue pike, the whitefish, the lake trout. They didn't like to catch, they didn't like the sturgeon to get mixed up with their nets because they could wreck the nets. Before the net lifters, the amount of nets that they could deploy were very limited because they couldn't pull them back up again. Yeah, I know. I just wanted to include this to give you an idea. This, of course, is when they were fishing from sailboats. And so you can see how the size of the fishing boat would have even limited how much of those lines and nets that they could take out with them. The early nets, the weights were usually stones, and the floats were usually hand carved out of some lightweight wood. They had to be detached every time they brought the nets into the boat, and then reattached when they put them back on. Once the net lifters were commonly in use, they were able to attach their individual nets together. And the nets were usually like 180 feet long. They would attach them together in different configurations and sink them down, and greatly increasing their catch. They also, in order to keep track of those nets, they all had log books where they would draw a diagram of the nets and how they had hooked them together, where the bends were. So originally they used natural fibers. That's all they had, cotton and linen. They needed to bring those nets in occasionally to dry them, to ward off rot, as you can imagine. And that led to the development of the most iconic feature in Barcelona photos, the net reels. They would bring the nets in to dry, but also to repair. And the retired fishermen, certainly my great-grandfather, I remember doing this, also spent time repairing the nets. It gave them something to do, I guess. So the iconic Great Lakes fishing tug had side doors and doors in the sterns that could be opened, all to accommodate the laying out of the gill nets and the retrieving of them. It was the front door where the net lifters were. You boaters know why it's there, not in the back. If you had it in the back and you were pulling up a lot of weight, your boat was likely just to flip right over. I think that happened actually to a football player in the Gulf of Mexico. They were fishing and his anchor got stuck. It was out over the back, and so he gunned his boat. He just flipped it right over. You can imagine. This is Captain Bob Burnell. He was a contemporary of my mom, and I remember him. He's leaning out of that side door, catching the fish that are falling out of the net. This is where the net reel brings the net up and into the boat. The crew is taking the net and loading it into crates that is then taken to the stern of the boat, where a couple of guys are actually sitting down and lifting the nets up and over their laps and taking the fish out as they do that. This is the other smaller side door. They're loading their catch onto the tenders to take it to the fish merchant. This is the Monroe fish house, and it's where the fish would be dressed for shipment. So by the 1920s and 30s, I found references to there being about 1,000 boats licensed to fish on Lake Erie in the U.S. side. According to what is known, what was known by an organization called the Bureau of the Fisheries. In 1922, they had licensed enough fishing nets that could, just for Lake Erie, that would, if put end to end, would stretch 1,400 miles. Canada at the same time had 800 miles of nets. Back in the heyday of fishing, 12,000 people were directly involved in commercial fishing on Lake Erie. At its peak, in the 30s and early 40s, the annual harvest of fish from Lake Erie exceeded 60 million pounds. And that was not good. Overfishing, pollution, stream habitat degradation, and accidental and deliberate introduction of non-native invasive species like the sea lamprey all played a part in the decline of the fisheries. The blue pike, which was a very popular fish, it was fished to the point of extinction. It's gone. In part, that's because it could not reproduce at a high enough rate to replace all the fish that were being taken out. And they couldn't do that because their habitat, the streams where they spawned, were in the 50s polluted, either with runoff from construction or from farms. In any case, you remember those days, some of you, not all of you. But when Lake Erie is described as being dead, that river in Cleveland talked about it. Let's come back. That was 60 years ago. It's come back. Today, the harvest is what has been described in what I've read as a sustainable level of 30 million pounds taken out every year. Most of that would be taken out in Canadian waters. Historically, cold water fishes like the whitefish and the herring, they were the most important commercially. Today, it's limited pretty much to yellow perch and walleye, which I think are called pickerel. Canada, is that right? In U.S. waters, commercial fishing for yellow perch is permitted in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York, with a big wait a minute for New York. So Lake Erie has 872 miles of shoreline. Ohio, with about 313 miles of shoreline, has granted 33 commercial fishing licenses. Pennsylvania, with 77 miles of shoreline, has allotted 3 licenses for trap nets and 40 for commercial seining. New York State, with 75 miles of shoreline, and 50 of that in Chautauqua County. The only licenses here are legacy licenses. They are granting no more. New York has opted a while ago to support sports fishing. It's virtually, although they do have regulations on how to apply for a commercial fishing license, it's virtually impossible to get one. Canada has a shoreline of about 300 miles. In Canada, commercial fishing on Lake Erie is a major and sustainable multi-million-dollar industry. Ontario has 178 commercial fishing licenses, primarily focused on yellow perch and walleye, and using gill nets. Gill nets in York in the United States were outlawed in 1970, and that pretty much put an end to commercial fishing for really paying fishers. Today, the allowable amount of harvesting of fishing is developed cooperatively by the Joint Great Lakes Fishery Commission. It's a joint organization between Canada and America, and it still operates. So Barcelona actually is still home port for commercial fishing. There are, I believe, 3 legacy licenses in Barcelona. I know 2 of them are really active. They allow fishing using trap nets for yellow perch only. Once the families that have those licenses stop fishing, they'll be gone. You might have noticed that there's no real harbor in Barcelona. This is where they ended up, on this side of that point, after the commercial or the center of commerce just failed. You can see by the height of the dock that Hermland built, how high the waves come in that bay. This picture was taken sometime in the 50s, and I think it's interesting because there still is no harbor, but you can see that wave action has created a sandbar that would provide a bit of a barrier, but it's also the reason that Bill Jagway had to be fishing out of Dunkirk. The lake water was so low he couldn't get in and out of this port. So when New York State decided they were going to go with sports fishing, they also put up the money to build a real harbor there. The east breakwall, which is the one toward the bottom, is, I think it's like almost 700 feet long, and the west breakwall, which today is pretty much buried in sand, is actually 790 feet long. In 1965, that access ramp was added. In 1984, they extended, and I have a picture of it, but they extended the breakwalls a little bit with putting boulders out. Before you came in, I talked with some of my friends about whether or not I was going to tell you this story, because I promised I wouldn't. At the end of the breakwall, there are 2 navigation lights. One is green, one is red. A fisherman named Pike Monroe, who was a contemporary of my mother, when he died, he was cremated. His son, Hank Monroe, who was also a fisherman, and couldn't say 2 words without swearing. Hank and his wife hauled Pike's ashes back and forth to Florida with them, and they bring them back up here. So when they were building the breakwalls and then extending them, Hank watched until he figured they were going to mount the red blinking light. And just before that, when he figured they were going to do it, he rowed out across the bay and dumped his dad's ashes down there. And when he told me that, I'm going to quote him, "Jesus Christ, don't tell anybody." So if you go there and if you see the big blinking light, think of Pike Monroe. I wanted to include this. If you've never been to Barcelona or over at Lake Erie when the lake has really kicked up because of a storm, it's hard to imagine the strength of those waves. I wanted to show you this because it's that little boat that would encounter them if they didn't get in in time. This little boat is coming back into harbor the day after Christmas. I don't know the story of why they were out on that day, but it's a picture that always, that I want you to remember as you go. Thank you.
They call them tugs. Why do they call them tugs?
I don't know. They just do. And they do. They refer their boats as the tugs.
Chris, you talked about how Canada has gill nets, United States has not gill nets since 1970. What were the politics behind of that decision?
That's a good question. I don't really know exactly what the politics were because I don't know who it was that was pushing for that. But I know that by the 1960s and 70s, when more and more people were going in for sports fishing, just as there is clashes on Chautauqua Lake between sports fishermen and people who are just there to go water skiing, on Lake Erie there was quite a bit of tension between the sports fishermen and the commercial fishermen. Especially the commercial fishermen felt that people would go out and cut their nets. So it was an issue. There's an argument to be made, a really good argument to be made that gill nets are cruel to the fish. They don't die. They're stuck in the net, and they do die. They stuck in the net, and so they suffocate.
Well, they're really not selected. Is the problem?
They're only selected by size.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So they don't target, and every fish pulled in is dead.
No, they might not be dead yet.
Yeah.
Depends on when they go out to collect the nets. But yeah, every fish that's caught is counted. So it would be. Yes. Yeah.
How much fish could they get on the boat? I mean, given the amount of all those nets and that sort of thing, and the boat was only 28 feet long, I mean, how many pounds of fish would they get with that?
I don't know.
A good catch.
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that they would take all of those nets out and lay them. Some of them, as I said, connected. And it might take them 2 or 3 days to be able to go out and get the fish from those nets because they couldn't bring them all in at once. If that was cruel as well. But the lake was so cold at the bottom that apparently the fish were kept like in a refrigerator if they had died. You know, Lake Erie is like a river. If you can picture the very shallow western end of the lake, when it gets deep like that. And so there's a flow. What did I read? It takes 2.5 years for water to transit the lake. But John Monroe told me that they had to put those tall poles up with the flags on them because their nets traveled. The water would push them.
Did you have to own lake shore property in order to commercial fish?
No. Do you have to own property in order to fish?
On the lake.
No. The only, the states, I don't, own isn't the right word, but the states regulated the lake out to the line, out to the international line from each of their borders. So if you had a license to fish in Ohio, you couldn't fish in Pennsylvania water. Or shouldn't. So thank you.